work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast. I'm really excited today to be joined by two organizers with Minneapolis United for Rent Control. Folks who've been listening to the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast, we've been talking about rent control as a really important policy for renters, for the working class and the poor in Minneapolis. Since we started this show, we've talked about housing policy, we've talked about gentrification, and we've talked about the real need for rent control as a pillar of a working class agenda, of a renter's agenda. So I'm really, really excited to be joined by people who are putting the work in to make it a reality. So I want to first welcome to the show Ginger and Qannani from Minneapolis United for Rent Control. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Sweet. Can we start? Could you just kind of introduce yourselves, who you are and what role you're playing in Minneapolis United for Rent Control?
Yeah, so my name is Qannani Omar. I'm a housing organizer with Harrison Neighborhood Association. Harrison Neighborhood Association is a Northside neighborhood that is a coalition partner of Minneapolis United for Rent Control. I also, just in terms of, personal capacity, probably would have been a volunteer anyways, but feel very lucky and fortunate to be, a member, like a staff member, kind of supporting this cause.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'm Ginger, and I'm a member of Socialist Alternative, and we're also a coalition partner in Minneapolis United for Rent Control. And I think after 2017 and the successful push to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour in Minneapolis, I know one thing we were discussing kind of throughout the course of that movement was not wanting to get any sort of minimum wage increases get immediately sucked up into people's rents, right? Like the fact that a lot of people are struggling with housing costs as a part of, the overall austerity that a lot of working class people feel in this moment. We wanted to make sure that this was a kind of comprehensive approach to trying to lift up and be part of a program for working class people in the city of Minneapolis and elsewhere. So I think the push for rent control was a natural part of that. Like you said, a tool in the tool belt around housing justice stuff. And so that was some of our interest in working on it. And, trying to make sure that we're fighting around issues that really matter to people in Minneapolis.
Hell yeah, that's awesome. Well, salute to you both and to everybody involved. For listeners, what we're going to do today is we're going to take some time to talk about the specific push right now. We're in a really urgent moment to make rent control a potential and a reality in Minneapolis. So we're going to start with the process and then stick with us, and we're going to talk about the specific proposal for rent control that this coalition is moving. We're going to dispel some of the myths about rent control. But what we want to start with is to talk about where things are in the campaign, in this fight to get rent control here and now. And it's kind of there's a lot of barriers and obstacles put in front of us by the legislative process to make rent control a reality. So could you all start by describing what is the process that we have to move through in order to implement a rent control law? And why are these 3 weeks right now very important for people to pay attention to and get involved?
Yeah, so the process, I'm going to go back a little bit. So in the 80s, there was a real big consolidated push by the landlord lobby to ban rent control in every state. So in the 80s, nearly every state banned some sort of rent control at the state legislation. Minnesota is no different. So in Minnesota, we are not allowed to have rent control. And the only exception is if cities decide to pass it by a majority vote. So you see cities like St. Paul, for example, that are putting their own, organizers in St. Paul are putting their own rent control policy on the ballot. And it's a policy that's strong. It's capped at 3%. It's universally applied. There's no special loopholes for developers or corporate landlords. I think they got almost 10,000 signatures, and they're going to vote on it in November. So their pathway is very clear and cut and dry. They've already seen the massive support in their communities. So at this point, it's just about organizing and making sure people turn up in November to vote.
Hell yeah, go St. Paul.
Yeah, St. Paul's doing it. St. Paul's doing it. Minneapolis, we also have a massive movement, but we have a lot more barriers in our way. Our charter is strange, and we don't necessarily have the straight access, or we can just go get 10,000 signatures, which would easily be done with a city that's majority renters, and put it on our ballot. So what city council members decided to do in January is open up the pathways to rent control. So there's two pathways. One pathway basically would change the charter and basically ask voters of Minneapolis, hey, do you want to give city council their permission to create their own rent control policy in the future? Not really sure what the policy would look for, but will you give them permission to possibly take on rent control and write something of their own? Okay. That's one pathway. Okay. And to me, it's a little problematic because we all have seen in different states, rent control means a lot of different things. Right. So this is just basically an umbrella term used to give city council members power. The second pathway would basically open up the pathway similar to St. Paul. It would say, do you want to give Minneapolis residents the power to put their own petition of rent control on the ballot in the future? So this pathway would essentially open it. If we won in November, it opens it up so we can put our MERC policy that's very similar to St. Paul's on the ballot the next coming year. We're advocating for that way. We really feel like this is the way to get the strongest rent control policy happening here. But as many of your listeners may know, the Charter Commission is a political body. They don't like allowing citizens to have the power to put forward their own policies that would help working class people. So we're seeing a lot of pushback on option 2. We're seeing a lot of strange terms of the tyrannical majority, which is basically mostly working class Black renters and Indigenous renters. We're seeing a lot of resistance to allowing people to really have autonomy of their housing stability. So actually tonight, the Charter Commission is going to be putting forward the recommendations to City Council. The good thing, though, is that City Council gave them 150 days to make this decision. So unlike last year, the Charter Commission can make a recommendation, and then the City Council, though, can just ignore it. They can say, you know what, we know what you're trying to do. We know you're trying to stop rent control from happening. We're going to ignore you, and we're going to put this on the ballot and let the people decide. So we're hoping that regardless what happens tonight, City Council will take the vote to put it on the ballot.
Okay, awesome. I really appreciate that explainer. Can I try to say that back to you just to see if, so there's two pathways, and there will be a ballot question that voters will vote on in November. And that will either be, do you give City Council permission to create a rent control policy, or do you give the people of Minneapolis a decision to create their own rent control policy and put it on the ballot? So, and we want option number 2. We want the city, the renters, to write their own rent control policy that's as strong as it can be and vote on it directly. Because what I know from my experience in Minneapolis is that the city council largely represents the landlord class, largely represents the status quo. And already in the rent control proposals that they've been forced, most of them have been adamantly against rent control for most of their political careers. Now the political winds have changed where they have to pretend like they're for it. So they'll try to pass a very watered down version. So we definitely want the people to be able to vote directly on a rent control policy. And what I understand is that although the Charter Commission is going to opine, they're going to put forward a position on it, the City Council are the decision makers. So it'll really be on the City Council. And when does the City Council make that decision? When will the City Council say which way they're going to decide?
No, I would say first, Jake, that's absolutely accurate. This is really, we want to have all pathways open to pass rent control, but the reality is to pass the strongest rent control possible, as Qannani was saying, we need to have that option of the renter-led petition, because this is kind of a question of political will. And we have to be honest and clear that we don't really trust City Hall to reflect the strongest possible rent control that is going to help the majority of working class communities, Black and Indigenous renters in the city of Minneapolis, because that's like not what we've seen from them over the past several years. And again, the influence and I think the power of the landlord and real estate lobby, they're just doing overtime work right now to try and make sure that these charter amendments don't actually get on the ballot. So that's like, to Qannani's point, it'll be next year really then when we'll be really debating the finer points of our rent control policy. But the landlord and corporate lobby are doing everything that they can right now to say that rent control is bad. And so that's why we are also putting forward a strong position, trying to be really clear about what strong rent control looks like. And so this year, it'd be late July or early August that we would probably see the city council voting on putting forward these charter amendments. And we want to make sure that that renter-led option is still on the table. And it's also partly why I think we want to be doing what we can to have this conversation now, because we need everyone to show up to whenever the council is going to vote on this, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person. Like, we've got to show up and be at that meeting to be really, really, really clear that not only are there thousands of people in the city of Minneapolis who are showing support by tweeting at their council members, talking to their council members, signing our petition to say that they want to be able to vote on strong rent control, but we also need those folks to show up to say, like, you cannot continue to try and keep people in poverty by pushing in continuing to keep the power in the hands of the landlord and real estate lobby in the city of Minneapolis. We need to be able to decide what it looks like to actually have more renters' rights and renters' power, and empowering a renter-led movement to be able to, kind of cut into the heart of this let the market decide approach that is so, powerful in our city right now.
Yeah, hell yeah. So listeners, look in the show notes. We'll link to the information for every single city council member, and we'll also do our best to use our platform to let you know when these votes are going to happen. And this is the time to get involved, to get loud and really put pressure on them. So I appreciate y'all clarifying that process. And if it goes in our favor the way we want, then it'll be November of 2022, the next election, when we potentially get to vote on a renter-created rent control policy. So it'll be when you go, just to clarify, even because, a lot of us working class people, politics turns us off as far as like official politics, So a charter amendment means when you go to the ballot and you vote, you're not just voting for candidates. Sometimes they put those questions on there. So there will be a question on the ballot that says, do you want a rent control policy? And you'll be able to vote yes or no. And that's potentially November 22 is what we're fighting for.
Yeah, exactly. And that's partly why I think, again, we need to be really clear. Strong rent control is capped at no more than 3%. Your rent could not be increased by more than 3% in any given year. That it would be universally applied, because we don't want to have the pockets of instability that have been produced over decades of the landlord lobby trying to cut away at existing rent control policy, right? Like, there's this thing called vacancy decontrol, which is meaning that when someone moves out, you can get rid of the rent control that has existed in those apartments. That's how price increases and displacement has happened in cities like New York and San Francisco and stuff. We want to make sure that it's retroactively applied. So like, let's say we pass it in November of 2022, we would want to lock in those rental prices at like around this time, right?
Yeah.
Like we would want to have it retroactively applied. And like all of this is partly why the landlord lobby right now is coming out and saying rent control would be terrible. They're putting their op-eds out there. They're fighting us with everything that they've got because they don't even want the process to be opened up. And the city council members are mostly talking about process right now. But as you said, like, why would anyone engage with something that feels very distant, is in a very hostile environment, and like feels very bureaucratic? Like, the point is, we're fighting for something right now that is connected to actually trying to be part of a housing policy that's going to help working class people in the city of Minneapolis. So I'm not trying to say like, let's engage in this bureaucratic process that's super alienating for no reason. It's just the worst, So like, this is why we're fighting around this strong policy now and trying to get people on board for that, if that makes sense.
Definitely makes sense. It definitely makes sense. I appreciate it. And you just already started to lay out a bit about, what Minneapolis United for Rent Control is putting forward. But can you maybe from the start lay out for me, what is the policy proposal that you all are fighting for? What does a strong rent control policy look like in Minneapolis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to take your point about Merck, we do have a strong policy platform, and city council members who say they're supportive of rent control, I think it's really important for people to listen when they say that. So rent control is just a term. It's all about policy. And we have seen resistance to getting some concrete answers in terms of, okay, again, we want to open all the pathways to rent control, right? We want as many options to get to rent control possible. But when asked to city council members, they just want to focus on the process. We're seeing numbers like 5% or 4% plus inflation, which is 7%. We're not hearing concrete, oh yeah, we want it universally applied. I have not heard one city council members say they are committed to having universal rent control. And that's kind of problematic because we know the minute you start making those exemptions, the minute you start carving out buildings, you're deteriorating the whole point. You're purposely creating have and have nots in the housing market. So in terms of policy, yes, this year is about opening the pathways, but city council could say, hey, whatever this strong, amazing proposal that Merck is proposing, we're going to enact it January 1st. They could do that. If they really are dedicated to rent control, we are happy to share our policy platform and, work with them and make it happen. But we're seeing a lot of ambiguous answers, a lot of non-answers, a lot of focus on pathways, which we know are important, but we want to know what it looks like. I think it's hard for the average person to say, yes, I want to give you control over rent control when they don't know what that means. If you tell someone, oh, it's going to include your building, don't worry. This is going to include, no matter where you move, you're only going to see a 3% increase. That means something. If you tell people you don't know what it's going to look like, you're already, I think, reinforcing the fact that this is a bureaucratic policy, this policy means nothing to you. So, yeah, it's really important to talk about what exactly does rent control look like.
Yeah, and I think I want to lift up some of the pillars that I've been so excited to hear you all talk about, and you both mentioned it. A universal rent control policy. That means every single rental unit, no matter the age of the building, no matter the size of the building, rent control applies to. Because what those who want to co-opt and weaken rent control will do is say it doesn't apply to buildings that were built after the year 2000 or after the year 2010, or it doesn't apply to fourplexes or it doesn't apply to duplexes. And that renders the rent control policy weak and unenforceable. And it means, and that's the real danger, I think, in our city is liberal co-optation. People will say, oh, I'm for rent control, but then they'll shred it into pieces. So listeners, if you're talking about rent control, we want universal rent control. And then when y'all say 3%, what does that mean? That's the second pillar I want to talk about, the amount allowed to increase. So how much would your rent control policy allow the rent to be increased?
We want to connect it to something that's, measurable. And so in this case, we would be looking at something like the consumer price index or yearly inflation or something like this, something that's generally been between 2 and 3% and is also something that's used as a metric, universally, so that it wouldn't be tied to something that is just specific to the city of Minneapolis or could be arbitrarily changed by the council or something along those lines. I think, Jake, what you were saying about universal rent control, it's crucial to having this be both enforceable and also have it be clear. And again, I think that any law that gets passed is only as strong as the renters' rights movement or the workers' rights movement or, the people who it applies to in some ways. So in that respect, also, one way we've seen rent control get eroded in other cities over the years, we need this policy to apply to the unit and not the renter. So that if someone moves out, you still have a rent-controlled apartment, and then that's part of the universal application. Another thing with the how enforceable it is and how robust, protections we have, we want to have a well-resourced renter protection board that has, empowers renters to be a part of this process, and that's also something we've seen over the years. We have examples of where those have been weakened, where you have landlords or other real estate lobby, sort of whatever affiliated people on these other boards that exist across the country. But in this case, since we're able to start from the scratch in this respect, we can say we want this to be people who are from kind of renters' rights work or committees, or this points in the direction of actually having a robust tenants' rights or tenants union movement in the city of Minneapolis, where you're representing your buildings, where you're representing other folks in your community, and that we could democratically decide who would represent us on that renters board that then is enforcing a strong rent control.
That's
and
awesome.
that would also prevent landlords and these other companies from passing on fees to tenants or renters, right? Like repairs fees or other like ways in which they're maybe trying to pass costs on to renters. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen as well. And so all of this is sort of, rent control isn't going to solve all of our housing problems, but it is at least a very clear way in which we can talk about taking concrete steps in the direction of empowering renters in the city of Minneapolis.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. So we're talking about a universal rent control policy that's applied to every unit. We're talking about a rent control policy that applies to the unit, not the tenant. So the building stays rent control in perpetuity. We're talking about a strong board for enforcing this policy that's comprised of renters and renters advocates that can be there to make sure it's getting enforced. Am I missing anything else about and some of the pillars of a strong rent control policy? Oh, and 3%, no more than a 3% increase that's tied to the consumer price index. So you're not seeing arbitrary increases in the price of rent. I think one example for folks to look at is Oregon. The state of Oregon passed a rent control policy a couple of years ago, and it set the limit at like 9% or something like that?
10%.
It was 10%. Which is like, you might as well not have a rent control policy. If my rent went up 10%, I'm gone. No way I can pay that. I could barely make a 1%, 2% increase, So it's very important too, if you look at some of the leading voices on the Minneapolis City Council and kind of the status quo politicians, point to that Oregon policy as something that should be replicated. And we need as renters to know absolutely not, nothing more than 3%. And it needs to be tied to a real number like you're talking about, the consumer price index. Hell yeah, I'm getting fired up now.
No, it's really great. And I just want to kind of uplift something you said, Jake, about when we say universal, we know too, Minneapolis, like I think the beautiful thing about this rent control policy that we're talking about, it really is, we talk to organizers in Oregon, we talk to people in New York and California, really trying to understand the dynamics and like what went wrong. You know what I mean? Like, how did you get to where you were? What went right? And I think it's important to understand the landscape of Minneapolis. So with California, single family homes are not included in rent control policies. In Minneapolis, that is 57% of the rental market. And most of those homes are on the north side. So if city council members say no single family homes,
absolutely,
they are disproportionately affecting Black renters who live in one of like the most disinvested neighborhoods in the city. So just want to highlight, I absolutely agree. The universal like aspect of it is important, but choosing not to be universal is actually impacting Black renters and Indigenous renters in the cities. So with you there, Ginger, for sure.
Hell yeah. Thank you so much for saying that.
Sorry, to add, Qannani's getting me fired up now too. Like basically, the city commissioned also this study around how rent control could be implemented. It was from the Center of Urban and Regional Affairs, the CURA study that we've alluded to a few times. And frankly, like overwhelmingly, it shows what renters have been saying and what Qannani is illustrating, that like a rent control policy could be implemented, a strong rent control, like what Minneapolis United for Rent Control is fighting for, could absolutely help renters in the city of Minneapolis. And one thing that they found was if a policy like ours had been implemented in 2009, it would have cut across a lot of the incredibly weak renters' rights and issues that have actually exacerbated our racial inequalities that exist in the city of Minneapolis. And this is like, I think, a huge part of, if everyone wants to talk about at City Hall, racial justice issues and whatnot, we have to get super concrete. And that in reality, we can't deny the fact that there's actually a study that exists commissioned by the city that shows that what Minneapolis United for Rent Control is fighting for is actually the best, policy that we could have on the table, and is absolutely what city council should pass. Or we should be able to have the right to put it forward as a renter-led petition to voters in the city of Minneapolis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, I want to play a little game now. So I'm going to get into my actor role, and I'm going to play the role of a hater. Because there has been, like you said, Qannani, this has been for decades a right-wing agenda point has been to demonize rent control, to spread lies about rent control. So I'm going to play a character who's internalized some of these myths. And you know what I'm saying? This will be practice for all of our listeners, because as we all get involved in agitating and organizing for rent control, we're going to run into this hater out there. So, rent control sounds kind of cool and everything, but isn't it true that rent control will stop the production of new housing? We really need new housing. And if you pass rent control, then nobody will build anything.
That's a good one. Qannani, do you want me to do it or do you want to do it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, I guess I'd start by saying that the claim that rent control reduces the quality or quantity of housing is actually a myth that's perpetuated by the landlord lobby and the real estate industry. And in fact, actually two of the biggest housing booms, and so this was not just commercial construction, but housing booms, units being built in New York City happened during periods of the strongest rent control that they've experienced. So in like 1947 to 1965, in the 1920s as well. And in reality, it's the landlord lobby kind of trying to chip away at that strong rent control that has just opened up more space for displacing renters and that kind of thing, which means that, it's not rent control that caused either more development or less development, but rent control didn't prevent that new construction, and actually was one of the only ways in which a lot of renters were still able to live in the cities where they had these big housing booms in the past. And actually, there's no better opportunity than to try and implement rent control at the same time as we are also trying to build more housing in a place where we're trying to accommodate, population growth and all that kind of stuff too.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add to that too. And something that's not discussed a lot, I know this is a great talking point that right wing likes to use, but after the recession, developers basically consolidated in the nation. So you had like what used to be cities that had many, many developers, many, many mom and pop construction businesses get bought out. There was a lot of acquisitions. I'm sure in Minneapolis, how many different developers do you really see? There's probably 3 or 4 of these cranes that we see. So they are basically, there's a monopoly there. So the idea of like there's small profit margins in developing like there were 20 years ago, that's not the case. Developers are doing just fine. There's just less of them and they set the price. That's something that I know doesn't get discussed often enough, but that is the reality in terms of like who's building and who really has the buying power. They're not forced into the position where if they were forced to make more rental units and there was competition, that's how they would be making their money. But they kind of they set the rents high. And that's kind of a conversation that should be happening locally, but more at the national level too, of like, why are we allowing these monopolies of a handful of developers deciding the rates of the whole country in terms of apartment units?
Absolutely. And a word that I want to throw in here, for all of our political education is capital strike. And when people say, oh, if you pass a rent control, we're not going to build more housing, that is the wealthy people who dominate our society threatening to pull their resources out. One, like you said, they're not going to do it, and they can still build with a rent control policy, and they will. But I think even to take it further is as we build more power as a working class, I'd like to say, go then, leave, and we can build public housing. We can build
exactly
public sector housing. So if you can't get with a strong renters' rights policy, get the fuck out. We don't need you, and we can use that public land that we're selling to you now to build actual public housing. We have to have more confidence and strength as a class to stand up to those threats. Okay, putting my hater hat back on. Rent control sounds nice, but if we force a rent control policy, then the landlords aren't going to take care of their units anymore. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, there is actually no data to support that. That's like a commonly said, that's a commonly said thing in many different cities and states, but there's just nothing to back that up. What they actually have seen and what New York finally just closed up in 2018 when they re-looked at their rent control laws because they had been gutted in the last 40 years is what landlords were doing because there was that vacancy control exemption. They would purposely redo, put in granite countertops, put in, a stainless steel microwave, and suddenly they would petition that they need to raise rent $1,000 a month. and they'd be able to do it. So there's actually been data to prove that with rent control, when there's actually more regulation, when there's actually more scrutiny on landlords to be a better landlord, there's been better maintenance. With how it is now, I don't know how Minneapolis landlords can make the argument that rent control and the way that the city has been behaving would create the effect that you're talking about.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and it's not like they're taking care of their properties now. And I just think that's another point, another potential carve out or exemption that people will try to use to weaken rent control is these upgrades and construction costs. And that, again, we cannot allow for that. You should update your apartment to be as safe and as nice as it can be, and those costs do not get passed down to renters or change the rent control law. And this seems to like point towards the point that you made, Ginger, about a strong rent control enforcement board who can be present every year, making sure that these things are being monitored and being enforced, right? So if somebody is refusing to care for their unit, then they need to be punished, and that's what that strong body would do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, when you run a business, you have a minimum wage, that's just a cost that goes into the cost of doing business. I would say that this is a similar type of thing. I mean, rent control is like, in the opposite effect, like a minimum wage for renters, right? Like we're just trying to make sure that nothing can be done without, the consent, I guess, of the renters' rights movement in that respect. And I think the more that people know what their rights are, and then it's enforced by a board that is able to, exert the power of renters in the city, the more that we're going to be able to actually prevent the displacement that has been so marked by housing struggles over, centuries under U.S. capitalism. The other thing I would say too is that like in this struggle, we're seeing a lot of support from, and I guess that we're in the hater question phase, but like I don't want to preempt a hater question, but like we're seeing a lot of support from working and middle class homeowners as well, who have a real stake at making sure that the stability of our neighborhoods is actually a part of like renters feeling like they have a stake in the neighborhood as well. And like we see people all the time who have a stake in the neighborhood as well, but are worried about getting priced out. And the way that gets flipped in conversation is somehow that we don't care. And that's just not true. Renters do give a lot of, care. I almost swore, care a lot about what happens in our cities and in our neighborhoods. But that's the thing is that like, I think that the support we're seeing from working and middle class homeowners and even small landlords, because they're not the ones who are price gouging tenants, right? It's the bigger properties. It's the multi-family housing association members who are also fighting at the state and national level to end the eviction moratorium during a pandemic, which is just utterly disgusting when we're talking about increasing homelessness and everything too. Like the stability, I think, of working in middle class neighborhoods is also about like having a well-resourced and empowered renters board and having people feel empowered to be able to make decisions about what our communities look like, which includes fighting for a strong rent control policy.
Hell yeah. Thank you for bringing up that point about, working class homeowners. And a word that I've been using just for my own clarity is like working class mortgage holders. In a lot of ways, people who we say homeowners, but people are paying a rent to a bank. And if you don't pay that mortgage, you get kicked out. And I know a lot of people who have a parallel struggle in the city right now where they maybe have a mortgage, but their property taxes are raising with gentrification to the point where they're being displaced. So I've even heard like some real creative ideas about, how could we pair a rent control policy with a property tax cap for working class mortgage holders, especially folks over north. There's a lot of older elders in our community who have been pillars who are losing their homes, as these new developments are coming. So solidarity with, the working class mortgage holders as well. I got one more hater question for you all. Everywhere where rent control has been implemented, it's failed, it doesn't work, and it actually leads to more displacement. What say you now?
Yeah, that is another false narrative that keeps getting pushed. Especially it's interesting when you actually have corporate landlord lobbyists saying this, because it is exactly the people who designed it. They've designed it in a way where we're like, we can't let this be successful. If this is too good, they're going to pass it everywhere, and then will eat into our profits. So people like to point to San Francisco, and they like to point to New York City, and they say, look, it's so expensive there. What people fail, I think, to like realize is in the last 30 years, the rent control policies were every year gutted, more and more exemptions. I think at one point in the 90s, New York City was losing thousands of rent control units a year. So they created de-vacancy control. So more and more of those units didn't become lost their rent control status. And the average median rent went up in New York City because they're not rent controlled anymore. It's less than 1% of units in New York City are rent controlled at this point. That's how it wasn't always like that. So tearing down and creating the exemptions creates this like very weak, watered down policy that makes it ineffective. And Merck agrees with that. If you don't have a universal policy, you're going to create pockets of instability. And you're going to have people who are being exploited by the market. So I would love to see, and I think studies have shown, rent control gives you housing stability. In San Francisco, it increased housing stability by 20%. And landlords will say, oh, well, people don't have mobility. But people like to stay in their neighborhoods. Like people, when you raise your kids and they go to the elementary school that's 3 blocks away, why would you move? People like to stay, and they like to create, you know what I mean? Like a history and roots there. So mobility is using the term of, no, you're not moving up. That doesn't really make sense in the way that we're talking about. We want people to be able to stay in the beautiful neighborhoods that they created. The most desirable neighborhoods in Minneapolis now, we're honestly mostly renter neighborhoods that created like a beautiful like family atmosphere, great food. They created this like culture as tenants, and now we have, and nothing against homeowners, but it became desirable because of renters. So to Ginger's point before, that like renters don't care. Renters basically created the most beautiful neighborhoods in Minneapolis, and now they're being pushed out. So absolutely. I think this is like really important to emphasize too, that they have put in, and now like there's developers that want to extract the walls. The investment they put in, they want to benefit from it.
Certainly.
Definitely. One thing to what Qannani was saying, I just found the number, since vacancy decontrol was passed in New York City, it sounds like, so, this is, again, when it was applied to the renter and not the unit. And then the idea that when they moved out, you could undo the rent regulation that existed on that unit. So you could get rid of the rent control on that unit. So since that vacancy decontrol was passed in New York City, the number of rent controlled units has fallen from 1 million to 43,000 in 2006 and is only decreasing, since 2006. Yeah. So just like rapidly we're losing housing that can even make it so that working class people can continue to live in the city of New York.
Yeah, and it's just obvious common sense that rent control is going to stop displacement. People get displaced because the rent goes up. And if you stop the rent from going up, people aren't going to get displaced as frequently. And if you know any working class people from San Francisco or New York, how deeply they love those rent control apartments. People will do anything for those apartments. So just because some urbanist who graduated from whatever and moved to the city 5 years ago tells you rent control is bad, stuff them in a locker. Tell them to shut up. Like, it's not, that's just ridiculous.
No, you're absolutely right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You're absolutely right. My sister lives in San Francisco. And what's always really impressed me when they, have lived in their rent controlled apartment, her and her husband, is that they are just really aware of what their rights are as a renter too. And they really exert that when the landlord tries to do something that they shouldn't, like they can cite the laws, they can cite, and I think that that's really a product of being very clear and conscious about the cost of your rent in comparison. I mean, we all are, but then like knowing that there's something that you can do about it and knowing where you can go to do something about it, to me is like a key aspect of what it looks like to be struggling over rent control in the city of Minneapolis, and why like having this conversation in a really robust and clear and broad way is so important. And this is why we really want people to show up to that council meeting where, even though we're talking about a pathway, we want to make sure that a renter-led approach is part of this pathway, because without us being able to exert, a strong rent control policy into this situation, which again, like is totally common sense, the ways in which this gets sort of peddled as though it's like there's unintended consequences and stuff like this. They always say that. Big business and the ruling class, they always say that when working class people try to assert our interests into a situation and organize around them. That's why we think it's super important to keep that renter-led option, and then also be talking about what it means to have this strong rent control policy, because we want to make sure everyone's aware of what's happening. We're putting up posters across the city. We're talking to people every single week on the street And we want to do what we can to counter the fact that big business and these real estate lobbyists are going to spend big money to try and like scare people away from what is actually in their best interest, which is a strong rent control policy.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Well, I think this has been a really informative conversation. And I just want to, while I have both of you here, say thank you and salute to you. You know, like this hard work is really important. I know Ginger and I, we've been working on rent control together for many years, you know, when it was like not so close to being a potential. So the fact that we're building this momentum and you are building this coalition, like my hat's off to you. I salute you both, and I'm really pleased and thankful that y'all came on the show. Can you let our listeners know how they can get involved? I know it's a lot of renters who listen, and what we want to do is go from, you know, podcasts are great and we love to be informed. Take that next step. You know, if somebody listens to this and wants to join the fight, how can they link up with y'all?
Yeah. So actually this Saturday, we're having an event at Curry Park. It's going to be noon to 2:33, and we're just basically going to be door knocking, putting up posters. People will be, we'll meet there to kind of congregate and hand out resources, and then send people out to just, you know, raise awareness. Moving forward too, we'll have probably several more like day of actions in terms of being in the different, all the wards. At this point, we see every city council member as a swing vote. So everyone needs to have the pressure on. So we're going to be canvassing in all the wards, talking to neighbors and making sure they're reaching out to their city council member and say, we want a renter-led option in November. So really pushing people to email their city council members. They can sign our petition. So at Minneapolis for rentcontrol.org, we have an organizing tool. So you sign our petition and it basically asks you how you want to plug in. And once you fill that out, we reach out to you, let you know when we have events, what's going on in your neighborhood, ways you can donate. We're fundraising as well to get some of these posters up and get visibility up for what will be a really intense next 3 to 4 weeks. And then, just even talking to your neighbors. I mean, this is all official ways to get involved with our campaign. But if you have neighbors, if you have family members who vote in Minneapolis, just talking to them and letting them know that this pathway is absolutely necessary to really bringing housing stability to Minneapolis.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. I would say too, like, if folks want to follow us on Minneapolis United for Rent Control on Instagram, it's a way to kind of stay up to date. And then also, we did a call out to, when we put the posters up initially, we did a call out to see who wanted to get involved. And like within 12 hours, we had people in wards 6, wards 9, 12, 10, 3, I think 11, 5, like people were just immediately reaching out, wanting to get involved. And so this is a growing movement, and you should come to our events and get involved in that way. Or if you're with an organization that you think should be supportive and should like also endorse, we've got the support of different labor unions like Unite Here and MATE, and we've got, community organizations like Harrison and the Cedar Riverside Community Council. And there's just a lot of different ways to get any way you're connected with your neighbors, friends, coworkers, to get them involved in this fight, because it's going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference to, small businesses in our communities as well. It's not just about, working and middle-class people in our houses who are facing price increases, but also just like the turnover of big business and industry that often has a big impact on, I think, what our neighborhoods look like overall. So that's what we're fighting for.
Hell yeah. Well, you heard it here from Qannani and Ginger with Minneapolis United for Rent Control. We're fighting for housing justice, and rent control is a big piece of it. Thanks for tuning in. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you're funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep